Clara Whitmore pressed her father's letter against her chest so hard her knuckles went white, then knocked on the door of a stranger who didn't know she existed. When the door swung open, the man on the other side looked at her, the way men look at trouble, like he already knew the cost. She didn't flinch. She held out the letter and said the only words she had left in the world. "My father said you needed a wife." The rancher went still, like a man who just heard a dead man speak. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss what happens next. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about loneliness, courage, and what it truly means to come home. The letter had been folded and unfolded so many times, the creases had gone soft, almost transparent. Like the paper itself understood, it carried something that could not bear too much weight. Clara Whitmore had read it every night since her father died. She had read it on the train out of Cheyenne. She had read it in the back of a freight wagon that smelled like pine resin and old leather. She had read it sitting on the side of a dirt road in the dark, her small suitcase beside her, the Montana mountains pressing down from every direction, like they were deciding whether to let her through. She had memorized every word. She had argued with every sentence. She had cried until she had nothing left to cry with. And then she had kept going because Thomas Whitmore had raised her to finish what she started, and this, whatever this was, had been the last thing he ever asked of her. The Caldwell Ranch sat at the end of a road that didn't look like it wanted company. There was no welcome in the fence line, no softness in the gate, no flowers near the house the way some ranch women planted to signal warmth from a distance. There was just land and work and silence, and at the center of it all, a man standing near the barn door with a saddle across his arm, watching her walk toward him like she was a problem he hadn't budgeted for. Ethan Caldwell was 38 years old and looked like a man who had earned every year the hard way. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of hands that came from decades of rope and iron and cold water. His face wasn't cruel, but it wasn't open either. It was the face of a man who had made his peace with a certain kind of life and didn't particularly welcome anything that might disturb it. He lowered the saddle slowly. He didn't say hello. He just looked at her. Clara stopped about 10 feet from him, because something in his stillness told her that closing that distance without permission would be a mistake. She was tired. Her feet ached inside her boots. She hadn't eaten since morning, and the afternoon light was already sliding toward evening. But she stood straight, and she met his eyes, and she held out the letter the same way she'd been rehearsing it in her head for 300 miles. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said. "Thomas Whitmore was my father. He passed 6 weeks ago. He left me this letter and your name, and he made me promise I'd deliver it in person." Ethan didn't move. He looked at the letter. He looked at her. He looked at the letter again. Something shifted in his face. Not softness exactly, but a crack in something that had been sealed a long time. He crossed the distance between them slowly, like a man approaching something he wasn't sure was real, and he took the letter from her hand without touching her fingers, which she noticed, and which told her more about him than anything he'd said. He read it standing right there in the yard. Clara watched him read it. She watched the muscles in his jaw tighten. She watched his chest expand slowly, with a breath he seemed to be holding deliberately, like he was bracing against something rising inside him. When he finished, he folded the letter with the same care her father had used when he first wrote it, and he looked out at the mountains for a long moment before he looked back at her. "How'd he go?" Ethan asked. His voice was low, rougher than she expected, like a voice that didn't get used enough to stay smooth. "Fever," Clara said. "He fought it for 3 weeks. He wasn't a man who gave up easy." "No," Ethan said quietly. "He wasn't." The silence between them was not comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of two people standing in the middle of something neither of them had chosen, and both of them understood was serious. "He shouldn't have done this," Ethan said finally. It didn't sound angry. It sounded tired. "I told him that," Clara said. "He didn't listen. He never listened to anything that contradicted what he'd already decided was right." Something almost crossed Ethan's face. Almost. Then it disappeared. "You hungry?" he asked. "Yes." "Come inside." He made coffee and heated up what was left from his noon meal: salt pork and beans, and a half a pan of cornbread that had gone dense from sitting. He set it in front of her without ceremony, and she ate it without complaint, and he sat across the table and drank his coffee and watched her the way a man watches someone when he's trying to decide something. "He saved my life," Ethan said when she was about halfway through the plate. "Your father. I don't know how much he told you." "He said he found you," Clara said. "After an accident in the mountains. He said you'd been out there 2 days. 3, Ethan said. 3 days. Horse threw me on the first day. I broke 2 ribs in my right leg and I was about 4 miles from anything that could help me." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Your father was running a line of traps alone the way he did every fall. He didn't have to stop. He could have gone on and pretended he didn't see me. Most men would have. My father never pretended anything in his life." "No," Ethan said again. "He didn't." He was quiet for a moment. "He spent a week nursing me back to enough health to travel. Fed me from his own supplies. Splinted my leg with wood he cut himself. Sat up with me 2 nights when the fever hit." He paused. "I offered him money when I was well enough. He wouldn't take it. He said a man doesn't charge another man for basic human decency." Clara felt her throat tighten. That was her father in 8 words exactly. "He wrote to me twice after that," Ethan continued. "Christmas mostly, just to say he was well. I wrote back." He looked at her. "I didn't know he was sick." "He didn't want anyone to know," Clara said. "He was private about weakness, even his own." Ethan nodded slowly, like that made sense to him in a personal way. "Miss Whitmore," he said carefully, "I owe your father more than I can ever pay. I understand what he was trying to do, but I have to be honest with you because I think you're a woman who'd rather hear honesty than kindness. I am. I'm not in a position to marry anyone. I'm not looking for a wife. I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "I don't have much to offer beyond a roof and steady work and a piece of land that's fighting me harder than it did 10 years ago. And I'm not an easy man to live with. The people in this county would tell you that freely." Clara set down her fork. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "I'm not here because I want a husband. I'm here because I made a promise to a dying man who loved me better than anyone in the world ever has or probably ever will. I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not asking you for anything you haven't already got." She met his eyes steadily. "I'm a hard worker. I'm good with numbers. I can keep a house and I can keep accounts, and I will not be a burden to you or your ranch. All I'm asking is a chance to earn my place somewhere because right now I don't have one anywhere else." The directness of it seemed to surprise him. He studied her for a moment, the way he'd looked at the letter, like he was reading something trying to find the catch. "You got any family?" he asked. "Besides him?" "No." "Friends anywhere you could go?" "If I had somewhere to go, Mr. Caldwell, I wouldn't be sitting in your kitchen eating your beans." That almost got him. The corner of his mouth moved, just barely. "There's a room off of the back of the house," he said finally. "It's got a bed and a window and a hook on the back of the door. You can stay tonight. We'll figure out the rest in the morning." "Thank you," Clara said. "Don't thank me yet," he said, and he stood up and carried his cup to the basin and set it down and walked out the back door without another word. She lay awake for a long time that first night, listening to the sounds of a ranch settling into dark, the horses shifting in the barn, the creak of the house adjusting against the cold that came down fast off the mountains, the distant bark of something out on the edge of the property. She thought about her father. She thought about the way he'd looked at her 3 days before he died, propped up against his pillows, with that absolute certainty he'd always carried, that infuriating calm that had driven her half wild her whole life, and that she'd have traded everything she owned to see again. "Ethan Caldwell is a good man, Clara," he'd said. "I know that's hard to take on faith, but I wouldn't send you to him if I wasn't sure." "Papa," she'd said, "you can't just send me to a stranger like a piece of mail." He'd smiled at that. Even then, even dying, he could smile at the things she said. "You're not a piece of mail," he'd told her. You're the best thing I ever did, and I am not going to leave this world without knowing you've got somewhere solid to stand." She pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes. She was not going to cry. She had done enough crying to last a long time. She was going to sleep. And in the morning, she was going to figure out how to make herself useful to a man who didn't want her here on a ranch that was fighting its owner harder than it should have been in a territory that was brutal to women standing alone. Her father had believed she could do it. That had to count for something. She was up before Ethan. She found the kitchen cold and the fire banked down to coals, and she built it back up without fuss and found the coffee and set it going. And then she stood at the kitchen table and looked at the mess of papers in the wooden crate shoved against the wall. She didn't touch them. Not yet. That wasn't her right. But she looked. Receipts. Invoices. Feed bills. What appeared to be cattle sale records several years' worth stuffed in without any system she could identify. A letter from someone in Billings that looked like it might be from a bank. She was still looking when Ethan came in through the back door with the cold air rolling off his coat and stopped short at the sight of her standing there with coffee ready and the kitchen warm. He looked at the coffee. He looked at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "Sit down, I'll pour." He sat with the expression of a man who wasn't entirely sure how he felt about that, and she poured and set the cup in front of him and sat down across from him with her own cup and said, "Your accounts. When did you last run them properly?" His expression shifted. "Excuse me, the papers in that crate." "I wasn't going through them," she said. "I just looked. But from what I could see, there are feed bills in there that go back at least 3 years, and what might be 2 different sets of cattle records that haven't been reconciled." He was quiet for a moment. "My wife used to handle that end of things," he said carefully. "I know. I'm sorry for your loss." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "She passed 4 years ago. I've been managing." "I can see that," Clara said. Not unkindly. Something flickered across his face. Something that looked very much like a man who had just been caught at something he'd been hoping no one would notice. "Miss Whitmore." "Clara," she said. "If I'm going to be living under your roof, Mr. Caldwell might get cumbersome." "Clara," he said. "I'm not asking you to work for me. I know you're not. I'm offering." She set down her cup and met his eyes squarely. "I spent 4 years keeping my father's accounts. He had a small trading business in addition to his trapping. I can read a balance sheet. I can see what's coming in and what's going out, and where the losses are hiding." She paused. "I can see those without even opening that crate. Your winter feed costs alone look like they're running higher than they should for a herd this size. How many head are you running?" He was looking at her differently now. Like the woman who'd knocked on his gate yesterday had been replaced by someone he hadn't expected. 62, he said slowly. 63 with the bull. "And you're buying all your feed from where Millard's in town?" A pause. "Yes." "What's his price per hundredweight on hay?" Another pause longer this time. 90 cents. Clara pressed her lips together. "Dawson's supply post, the one on the Fort Benton Road, I passed it coming in. He's posted 65 cents. That's nearly a third cheaper." Ethan stared at her. "I've been buying from Millard for 12 years, he said. "I understand loyalty," Clara said. "But 30 cents a hundredweight over the amount of feed 63 head requires through a Montana winter, that's a significant loss you don't have to take." The silence stretched out between them. Then Ethan Caldwell, who had been managing alone for 4 years, and who was not a man who adjusted easily to anything, picked up his coffee cup and looked at the crate of papers against the wall and said quietly, "How long would it take you to go through those?" "A day," Clara said. "Maybe 2. "And what would you need?" "Paper. A pen. Somewhere to work." He nodded slowly. Then he looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not warm exactly, but something that wasn't closed either. "We'll try it," he said. "We'll see how it goes." It wasn't a welcome. It wasn't warmth. But it was a door left open. And Clara Whitmore had learned from the best that sometimes a door left open is the only invitation worth waiting for. The town of Harlow was 3 miles from the Caldwell Gate, and by the end of Clara's first week, it already knew about her. Small towns had their own kind of telegraph, faster than wire, more personal, and considerably less accurate. What got back to her through the things Ethan mentioned in passing was a serviceable portrait of what people were saying, that the Caldwell man had taken in a strange woman from out of territory, that she'd come alone and without family, and that nobody quite knew what to make of it. What Ethan didn't mention, but what Clara pieced together from the slight change in his expression when he came back from town on Thursday, was that the commentary was not entirely charitable. "What are they saying?" she asked him directly when he came in and hung his coat. He paused. "Nothing worth repeating," he said. "Mr. Caldwell?" "Ethan," he said. "You said it was cumbersome." "Ethan," she said, and she thought she saw something ease slightly in his shoulders. "I'm not fragile. I'd rather know." He turned to face her. "There's talk. About why you came. About what your arrangement is exactly." He looked at her steadily. "People make assumptions when a young woman arrives alone at a widower's property with a suitcase." "I see," Clara said. "I don't care what they say about me," Ethan said. "I never have. But it's not fair to you." "No," Clara said. "But it's not unusual either. People always have something to say about a woman who doesn't fit somewhere they expect." She turned back to the ledger she'd been working on. "The more important question is whether you care." "I told you I don't." "Then it doesn't matter," she said simply. "Let them talk." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not what I expected," he said. She looked up. "What did you expect?" He seemed to consider that honestly. "Someone frightened," he said finally. "Someone needing managing." "I know," Clara said. "Most people do." She looked back down at the ledger. "I lost my mother at 11, Mr." She caught herself. "Ethan, I kept house for my father from the time I was 12. I have been managing my own affairs and his for most of my adult life." She ran her finger down a column of figures. "I'm not fragile, and I'm not frightened. I'm just alone. There's a difference." He stood there for a moment longer than was necessary. Then he said, "There's a loose board on the back porch that needs fixing before the snow comes. I'll get to it tomorrow." "I know," Clara said. "I noticed it 2 days ago. I put a piece of canvas over it so the wet doesn't get under the planking and warp it further." He looked at her. She did not look up. "Right," he said, and he went to wash up for supper. She found the discrepancy on the 9th day. She'd been working through the cattle sale records, methodically building a picture of 3 years of transactions, cross-referencing weights and prices and dates, and on the 9th day, she stopped with her pen held still above the paper and looked at a number that didn't match. Not an error. Not a mistake. A pattern. Consistently over 3 sale cycles, the recorded weight of cattle delivered to Harlow's stockyard came in lower than what Ethan's own branding and birth records suggested the animals should weigh. Not dramatically. Not enough to notice if you were tired and overworked and doing it all alone. But consistently. Steadily. 7%, 3 times running. Clara set her pen down carefully. She stood up. She went to the barn, where Ethan was working with a young horse along the near wall. Patient and methodical, talking low to the animal in a voice he never quite used with people. "Ethan," she said. He looked up. "I need to ask you about your stockyard man," she said. "The one who takes the cattle at sale. What's his name?" Ethan frowned slightly. "Roy Prentice. He's been running Harlow's yard for 6-7 years. Why? Who owns the stockyard?" He was fully still now, reading her expression. "It changed hands 2 years ago," he said. "Sold to Margaret Holloway bought it, as part of her acquisition of—" He stopped. Clara watched him get there on his own. "As part of her acquisition of several properties in the valley." He finished more quietly. "That's what I thought," Clara said. "Come inside. I need to show you something." He came. She spread the records out on the kitchen table, and she showed him the numbers, slowly, clearly the way her father had taught her to show things to people who needed to see them, rather than just be told. Following the trail, letting each piece land before she moved to the next. When she was done, Ethan stood very still with both hands flat on the table. 7%, he said. Every sale. Consistent. That's... He did the calculation in his head. She watched him do it. Over 3 cycles, that's been roughly $240, Clara said, at current prices. He looked up at her. I haven't got proof she directed it, Clara said carefully. Roy Prentice might be doing it on his own, but he works for her, and she owns the scale house. And the pattern started within 2 months of her acquiring the yard. She paused. And there's something else. Tell me. The letter in the crate. The one from the bank in Billings. She pulled it out. Did you read this? I've been meaning to. She set it in front of him. He read it. She watched his face. This is a notice, he said slowly, about the Eastern Boundary Survey. Someone filed a boundary contest, Clara said, 6 months ago, claiming the eastern 40 acres of your riverland were misdescribed in the original grant. She looked at him. Who owns the land adjacent to your eastern boundary? The silence in the kitchen was its own kind of answer. Margaret Holloway, Ethan said. Yes, Clara said. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind had come up running cold and hard off the mountains, and the house settled and creaked around them. Clara, Ethan said finally. His voice was different, not harder. Something more careful. How did you learn to do this? She thought about her father sitting across a table exactly like this one with papers between them, showing her how to follow a number until it told the truth. My father, she said simply. Ethan nodded slowly. He looked at the papers spread across his table, his records, his land, his losses. That he had been too tired and too alone, and too proud to understand, were not bad luck, but something deliberate, and he said in a voice that carried something in it she hadn't heard from him before. Something that might have been the beginning of trust. What do we do next? Clara pulled the papers into a careful stack. First, she said, we make copies of everything. 2 sets. One here, one somewhere she can't get to. She looked up at him. Then we find out exactly what that boundary contest is built on, because if she manufactured the survey error the way I think she did, there will be original records somewhere that contradict it. She paused. And then Ethan, we make sure she knows we have them. He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had arrived at his gate 9 days ago with a suitcase and a dead man's letter and exactly nowhere else to go. This woman who had in 9 days found what he had missed for 3 years. All right, he said quietly. That was all. But the way he said it, steady and certain and something close to relieved, told Clara everything about what it meant for a man like Ethan Caldwell to stop fighting alone. She uncapped her pen. She pulled the first sheet of paper toward her, and she began to write. The copies took 2 full days. Clara worked at the kitchen table from first light until the lamp needed trimming at night, and Ethan brought her coffee without being asked, and didn't interrupt her, which told her more about him than any conversation could have. A man who understood the value of silence when something important was being done was a man who had learned that lesson from experience. She wrote everything twice. Every figure, every date, every discrepancy she'd found in the cattle records, every detail from the bank letter about the boundary contest. She built each copy with the same precision her father had drilled into her from the time she was 12 years old, sitting beside him at a work table exactly like this one, her small hand cramping around a pen, while he said, Clara, a number written sloppily is a number that can be argued with. Write it so there is no argument possible. She wrote it so there was no argument possible. On the afternoon of the second day, Ethan came in from the barn and stood behind her and looked over her shoulder at what she'd built, 2 identical ledgers, organized by date and transaction type, with the discrepancies flagged in a separate column and the pattern laid out in a single summary page at the front of each. He was quiet for a long time. My wife tried to organize these once, he said, after the first year. I told her I had it handled. Clara didn't say anything. I didn't have it handled, he said. No, Clara said. But you were managing everything else alone. A man can only hold so much. He stepped back. She heard him pull out the chair across from her and sit down, and when she glanced up, he was looking at the summary page with the expression of a man who had just had something confirmed that he'd suspected, but hadn't wanted to know. $240, he said again. Like the number needed to be said aloud one more time to become real. At minimum, Clara said. That's only the 3 cycles I could reconstruct clearly. If it started earlier and the records are missing. They're not missing, Ethan said. He stood up and went to the back room and came back 3 minutes later, carrying a second wooden crate she hadn't seen before, set it on the table beside her and said, I just hadn't got to those. Clara looked at the crate. She looked at him. Ethan, she said carefully, how long has it been since you actually went through your own accounts? He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. A while. How long is a while? A pause. Since Eleanor died, he said. 4 years. 4 years of receipts and invoices and cattle records piling up in crates because looking at them meant sitting at the table where his wife used to sit, and some things were easier to leave in a box. Clara understood that completely. She had left her father's coat hanging on the hook by the door for 2 weeks after he died because she couldn't make herself take it down. All right, she said, and she pulled the second crate toward her. Go do whatever needs doing outside. I'll be here. He looked at her for a moment. You don't have to... Ethan, she said. Go. He went. She worked until the lamp burned low, and when she finally set down her pen and pressed her fingers against her eyes and stretched her back against the ache of hours bent over paper, she had a number in her head that was considerably larger than $240. She would tell him in the morning. Tonight, she needed to think. She told him over breakfast. She had learned already that Ethan absorbed difficult information better when he had something to do with his hands. So she waited until he was cutting into his biscuit, and then she said, the real number is closer to $600, possibly more. The knife stopped. Over how long? He asked. His voice was very quiet. That particular kind of quiet that in some men was the thing right before anger. And in Ethan, she was beginning to understand, was the thing right before absolute stillness. 5 years, she said. The short weighing at the stockyard goes back further than I initially thought. And there are 2 feed invoices from Millard's that don't match the delivery receipts someone signed for quantities that don't correspond to what you'd have needed for your herd size in those seasons. Ethan set down his knife. Someone signed for them, he said slowly. Or someone altered them after. Yes, Clara said. That's the question. He pushed back from the table and stood up, not in anger, but in the way of a man who needed to be standing for this, and he walked to the window and looked out at the yard and was quiet for long enough that Clara let him be quiet. Roy Prentice has been short-weighing my cattle, he said finally. Not a question. Yes. And someone has been falsifying my feed invoices. Yes. I can't tell you who yet. The signature is illegible. But the pattern on the invoices starts within a month of when Margaret Holloway acquired the stockyard, which is the same window as the short weighing. So it's coordinated, he said. It looks that way. He turned from the window. Why, she's the richest person in this valley. She doesn't need $600 from me. No, Clara said. She doesn't. The money isn't the point. She folded her hands on the table. The boundary contest is the point. The money is just pressure, making your operation harder to run, more expensive, more difficult. So that when the contest drains you further with legal costs, you're already weakened. She met his eyes. She wants your riverland, Ethan, the water rights that come with it. That's worth considerably more than $600. He looked at her for a moment. How do you know about water rights? He asked. My father did business with ranchers for 20 years, Clara said. I know what water is worth in dry country. Something shifted in Ethan's face. Not surprise exactly, but the recalibration of a man who keeps finding that his assumptions about a person are inadequate. What do we do about Prentice? He asked. Nothing yet, Clara said. Not until we know more about the boundary contest. If we confront Prentice now, we lose the element of surprise and give Margaret time to prepare. We need the survey records first. She paused. Where are the original land grant documents for this property? I've got them, Ethan said. In the tin box in the bedroom. I need to see them. He went and got them without argument, and he stood beside her while she spread them on the table and read through them methodically, her finger tracing the boundary descriptions, the survey notations, the dated signatures at the bottom. She found what she was looking for in 11 minutes. Here, she said. He leaned in over her shoulder. The eastern boundary is described from a fixed survey post. She said, set in 1871. The post number is recorded here, number 47. She tapped the paper. The contest filing will claim the survey post was misdescribed or mislocated. But if post 47 still exists and we can locate it, the original description stands. She looked up at him. Do you know where that post is? Ethan was very still. I know exactly where it is, he said. I rode that boundary every spring for 15 years. Something moved across his face, something grim and sure. She'd need to remove the post to make the contest work. And if she hasn't done it yet, then we need to get there before she does, Clara said. They looked at each other. Can you ride? Ethan asked. Yes, Clara said. We go tomorrow, he said. First light. She had not told him she hadn't ridden in 2 years, which turned out to matter less than she expected, because the horse Ethan put her on was a steady bay mare named Dulcie, who seemed to understand without being told that her job today was to be reliable, and reliability was something Clara could work with. They rode east in the early morning cold. Ethan on his gray gelding, Clara on Dulcie, the two of them moving at a pace that covered ground without wasting energy. Ethan didn't talk while he rode, which suited Clara fine. She was busy watching him the way he read the land. How his posture changed when they crossed from one kind of terrain to another, the slight tightening of his hands when they passed a section of fence line that had been repaired recently and not by him. That's your fence, she asked, nodding at it. Ethan looked at it. His jaw went tight. It was. That repair is recent, different wire gauge. Yes, he said. I noticed it last month. I assumed one of the neighboring boys did it as a favor. He paused. I don't think that now. Someone was marking the boundary, Clara said, making sure they knew exactly where it was. Yes, Ethan said. They rode on. The survey post was exactly where Ethan said it was, at the base of a particular rock formation on the eastern edge of the property, stamped with the number 47 still solid in the ground, clearly undisturbed. Clara got down from Dulcie and crouched beside it. She ran her hand along the stamped metal. She looked at the position relative to the rock formation, memorized. It measured the distance from 3 fixed points with a length of cord Ethan handed her without being asked, and wrote everything down in the small notebook she'd carried in her coat pocket. She hasn't moved it, Clara said. No, Ethan said. She will. Once she realizes we're not simply going to pay the legal fee and settle, once she understands you're going to fight. Clara stood up and brushed the dirt from her knees. We need to document this today. Witnesses would be better. I know a man, Ethan said. Tom Briggs. He's a retired land surveyor, lives about 4 miles north, honest as they come. Would he come out today? For me, yes. Ethan looked at the post, then at her. He knew Eleanor. Clara nodded. Then let's go ask him. Yeah. Tom Briggs was 70 years old and walked with a cane and had the sharpest eyes Clara had ever seen on a person of any age. He came out to the eastern boundary that same afternoon, riding a mule that moved faster than it had any right to listen to Clara's explanation of the boundary contest while examining the survey post, and then looked at her over his spectacles with an expression that was partly professional assessment and partly something warmer. "Young lady," he said, "where exactly did you learn to read a land grant?" "My father taught me," Clara said. "Smart man," Tom Briggs said. "The smartest I ever knew," Clara said. Tom documented everything. He sketched the post location measured from fixed reference points, noted the stamp number and condition signed, and dated his notes, and then he looked at Ethan with an expression that said several things at once. "Ethan," he said, "this contest won't hold if you fight it. The post is exactly where the original grant says it is. Whoever filed that boundary claim either made a significant error or they didn't," Ethan said flatly. Tom looked at him for a long moment. "No, they didn't." He glanced at Clara. "You need to file a response with the county recorder's office, with my documentation and your original grant. The sooner the better." "How soon?" Clara asked. "I'd say you've got about 3 weeks before the contest moves to the next stage," Tom said. "After that, it gets considerably more expensive to fight." He tucked his notes carefully into his coat. "I'll write up my formal findings tonight. You can have them by morning." "Thank you, Tom," Ethan said. The old man looked at him steadily. "You've got good help here, Ethan." He said it quietly, like something that mattered. Ethan didn't answer, but on the ride back, when Clara's silence had stretched long enough that it was comfortable rather than strained, he said without looking at her, "You didn't have to come out here yourself. You could have told me what to look for." "I know," Clara said, "but you came anyway." "It's your land," she said. "I wanted to see it." He was quiet for a moment. "What did you think?" he asked. She looked out at the land around her, the way it ran up against the mountains, the river glinting in the low light, the long grass moving in the wind, coming down off the peaks. "I think your father's father picked well," she said. Something in Ethan's face shifted. Something private and old. "He did," Ethan said quietly. They rode the rest of the way home in silence that felt for the first time like something shared rather than something endured. The filing at the county recorder's office was set for the following Thursday, and in the 6 days between the ride to the eastern boundary and that Thursday, 3 things happened that changed the shape of everything. The first was that Margaret Holloway came to call. Clara was at the kitchen table where she spent most of her time, now surrounded by organized papers and 2 ledgers and Tom Briggs's formal survey documentation, when she heard a buggy in the yard and Ethan's voice outside, and then another voice, a woman's, that was pleasant on the surface, the way certain things are pleasant on the surface. She didn't go out. She waited. Ethan brought the woman in, which told Clara immediately that he hadn't wanted to, because he was the kind of man who kept things he was wary of at the appropriate distance. Margaret Holloway was perhaps 50, handsome, in an architectural way, dressed in the manner of a woman who spent money as a form of communication. She looked at Clara with the expression of a woman who had expected to find a timid girl and had found something that required reassessment. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "I've heard so much about you." "Mrs. Holloway," Clara said. She did not stand up because standing up would mean moving her papers, and she didn't want to move her papers. "Please sit down." Something flickered in Margaret's eyes at the easy authority of that, but she sat. Ethan remained standing. "I wanted to come by personally," Margaret said, "to welcome you to the valley. We don't often get newcomers who stay." She smiled. "What brings you all the way from Wyoming, if you don't mind me asking?" "Family," Clara said simply. "How lovely," Margaret said. She turned her attention to Ethan with the manner of someone who considered the more important conversation to be with him. "Ethan, I also wanted to speak with you about that matter with the county recorder. The boundary question. I'm sure it's just an administrative confusion. These old surveys are so terribly imprecise, and I'd hate for it to go to a formal proceeding, when I'm sure we could resolve it simply between neighbors." "Between neighbors," Ethan said. "Like neighbors." "Exactly," Margaret said warmly. "And what kind of resolution did you have in mind?" Clara asked. Margaret looked at her. The warmth didn't quite reach the eyes. "Well, I thought perhaps we could discuss a small boundary adjustment, the simplest thing really, and fair compensation of course, rather than go through the expense and unpleasantness of a legal proceeding. What compensation? Clara asked. I'm prepared to offer $200 for the eastern 40 acres, which is, I believe, quite generous for marginal riverbank land. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at the woman across the table. She looked at her for long enough that Margaret's pleasant expression developed a slightly uncertain quality around the edges. Mrs. Holloway, Clara said, $200 for 40 acres of land that includes water rights on a river is not generous. It's an insult. She kept her voice entirely pleasant. And the boundary is not confused. It's exactly where it was when this grant was filed in 1871, as a retired county surveyor documented 2 days ago, so the proceeding will go forward. She set her pen down. Is there anything else we can help you with today? The pleasant expression was gone. Margaret looked at Ethan, and what was in her eyes now was a different quality of attention, the calculating, reassessing look of a woman who had thought she understood the situation and had just discovered she didn't. Ethan, she said quietly, I hope you understand what you're doing. I understand it fine, Ethan said. Clara. He opened the door. Margaret stood. She smoothed her skirt with precise hands. She looked at Clara one more time, and whatever she saw there settled something in her expression into something harder. Good day, Miss Whitmore, she said. Good day, Mrs. Holloway, Clara said. The door closed. In the silence after Ethan turned from the window and looked at Clara. $200, he said. She expected you to take it, Clara said. She expected a tired man who didn't know how bad the numbers were. She began straightening her papers. She'll try something else now. What? I don't know yet, Clara said honestly. But she'll try something. People who build what she's built don't walk away from a table easily. She looked up at him. Be ready for it. He nodded slowly. Clara, he said. She looked at him. Thank you, he said, for not standing up. She almost smiled. The papers. I know, he said, but still. The second thing that happened was the rumor. It came back to Clara through Ethan on a Wednesday evening, and she could tell by the set of his shoulders when he came in that it was bad enough that he'd been deciding how to tell her for the 3 miles between town and home. Tell me, she said, before he'd even hung his coat. He hung his coat. He sat down. He looked at the table. There's talk, he said, that you married me for the ranch, that you found out about the land before you came, that the whole thing with your father's letter was arranged. Clara was quiet. There's also talk, Ethan continued, his voice careful and flat, that you're not Thomas Whitmore's daughter at all. The room was very still. Who started it? Clara asked. It came through 3 different people at the feed store, Ethan said. Nobody claimed to know the source. Nobody needed to, Clara said. No, he agreed. She stood up and went to her room and came back with the small leather folder she kept at the bottom of her suitcase, the one she hadn't opened since she left Wyoming. She laid it on the table in front of Ethan and opened it. Her parents' marriage certificate. Her own birth record. 3 letters in her father's handwriting addressed to her from different years, the kind a man writes his daughter when he's thinking about the future. A photograph, small and slightly faded, of Thomas Whitmore, holding an infant girl with a woman beside him, who had Clara's same straight posture. Ethan looked at every document. He looked at the photograph for a long time. You look like her, he said. Your mother. Everyone says that, Clara said. My father said I had her eyes and her stubbornness in equal measure. Ethan's mouth moved, just barely. He wasn't wrong. She gathered the documents carefully and put them back in the folder and set it to one side. Do you need anything else? She asked. To be sure. He looked at her directly. No, he said. I don't. Something in Clara's chest eased quietly without announcement. It won't stop the talk, she said. Talk stops when people run out of something to say, Ethan said. We'll give them something better to talk about when we win the filing. It was Clara realized the first time he'd said we without any hesitation. She noticed it. She did not say so. The third thing that happened was the thing she hadn't expected. It was late the night before the courthouse filing, and Clara had been awake for an hour in the dark, going over the documents in her head, running through the sequence she'd present, and the questions she anticipated, and the counter-arguments she'd prepared for. She was good at this. Her father had made her practice. It made her argue both sides of every position until she could find the weakness in her own case. But the night before, something important always had its own quality of alertness that was distinct from ordinary wakefulness. She heard Ethan moving in the kitchen. She lay still for a moment. Then she got up. He was sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, with his hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, not drinking it, just sitting. She could see the shape of him in the faint light coming through the window. She lit the lamp. He looked up. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Me neither," she said. She took the cup from his hands, dumped it, poured fresh, and set it back in front of him. Then she poured her own and sat down. They sat in silence for a while. "I've been thinking about Eleanor," he said finally. Clara waited. "She would have liked you," he said. "She'd have said you were exactly what this place needed." He looked at his cup. She was like that. She saw what something needed, and she said it even when it wasn't comfortable. "She sounds remarkable," Clara said. "She was," Ethan said. He was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't a good enough husband to her. I was too closed. Too much in my own head. She deserved better than a man who showed his love by fixing fences and kept his actual feelings to himself like they were something private to be ashamed of." He paused. "She told me that once, not unkindly. She told me she knew I loved her, but she wished sometimes I'd say it out loud before the feeling went cold." Clara didn't say anything. She just let him talk because he needed to talk, and he'd been not talking for a long time. "I never said it often enough," he said. "And then she was gone and I couldn't say it at all." He looked up at Clara. "I tell you this, not because I'm looking for sympathy. I tell you because you should know who you've come to, the kind of man you're dealing with." "I know who I'm dealing with," Clara said quietly. "I've been watching you for 3 weeks." He looked at her. "You brought me coffee every morning without being asked," she said. "When I made an error in the third ledger and corrected it with a note, you didn't say anything, but you went back and read the correction. And I could tell by how you asked your next question that you understood the adjustment. When Tom Briggs made that comment about me having good help and you didn't answer, it wasn't because you disagreed. It was because you didn't know how to say out loud that you did." She held his gaze. "I know who you are, Ethan. I'm not frightened by it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Your father," he said, "was a very wise man." "Yes," Clara said. "He knew," Ethan said slowly, "that what I needed wasn't a wife exactly. He knew what I needed was someone who wouldn't run from the silence." Clara's chest did something she hadn't prepared for. She looked down at her coffee cup. "He always said," she said carefully, "that the right kind of quiet between two people is worth more than any amount of conversation." She paused. "I didn't understand what he meant when I was young." She looked up. "I think I'm starting to." Outside, the wind moved through the dark and the house settled around them, and neither of them said anything else for a long while. But neither of them went back to bed either. They sat at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low between them, and in the morning they would go to the county courthouse and begin the process of taking back what was his and the woman Margaret Holloway had dismissed as an ignorant girl from Wyoming, was going to show that valley exactly what Thomas Whitmore's daughter was made of. But that was tomorrow. Tonight in the kitchen, that had once held only silence, there was the sound of two people breathing in the same room, and that Clara thought was already something. The county recorder's office smelled like old paper and lamp oil, and the particular kind of institutional patience that accumulates in rooms where people come to settle things that matter. Clara had been in places like this before her father had taken her to the land office in Cheyenne, twice when she was 17, teaching her how bureaucracy worked, the way other fathers taught their sons to track or trade. Learn the system, he'd told her. The system is just people, and people can be understood. She understood the two men behind the counter in about 45 seconds. The younger one was nervous and deferred to everything. The older one, the county recorder himself, a man named Aldous Fitch, was the kind of official who had held his position long enough to believe it made him important. He looked at Ethan when they came in, acknowledged him with the brief nod, due a man of some standing, and looked at Clara the way men like Aldous Fitch looked at women who came into official offices with a polite blankness that communicated she was probably there to observe. Clara set Tom Briggs's survey documentation on the counter. She set the original land grant beside it. She set her own ledger summary beside that. Then she looked at Aldous Fitch and said, "We're here to file a response to the boundary contest on the Caldwell grant. I have the original survey documentation, a current independent verification by a retired county surveyor, and evidence of financial irregularities connected to the same party who filed the contest. I'd like to begin with the boundary response, because that's time-sensitive, and then I'd like to discuss the financial matter with whoever in this office handles referrals to the territorial marshal." Aldous Fitch looked at her. He looked at Ethan. Ethan said nothing. He just stood there with his arms crossed and let Clara be exactly what she was. "The territorial marshal," Fitch repeated. "Yes," Clara said. "Is there a chair? This may take a while." It took 3 hours. Clara walked Fitch through every document in the sequence she'd prepared, answering his questions before he finished asking them, redirecting twice when he started down paths that weren't relevant, and twice more when he tried to slow things down in ways that suggested he was stalling for reasons she didn't entirely trust. The third time he stalled, she looked at him directly and said, "Mr. Fitch, is there a reason you're reluctant to record the survey verification?" The younger clerk looked at his shoes. Fitch said carefully, "I simply want to make sure the documentation is in order." "It's in order," Clara said. Tom Briggs documented 20 years of county surveys before he retired. His methodology is sound, and his signature is on file in this office. She tapped the paper. "Is there something specific you'd like me to clarify?" Fitch looked at the document. He looked at Ethan. He stamped the form. Clara recorded the time in her notebook. When they came out of the recorder's office onto the street, Ethan stood on the boardwalk for a moment and said, "He was going to stall us." "Yes," Clara said. "He's in her pocket." "I don't know that," Clara said. "He might just be cautious, but I wrote down the time he stamped that form and the clerk's name as a witness, so if anything happens to that filing between now and the hearing, there's a record." Ethan looked at her. "You thought of that before we went in," he said. "I thought of that 2 days ago," she said. He was quiet. "Clara," he said. She waited. "I need to tell you something about Margaret Holloway," he said. "Something I should have told you before we went in there." The way he said it made her go still. "Tell me now," she said. He looked at the street, then back at her. "Roy Prentice, the stockyard man, he came to see me last spring. Said he had concerns about some of the weighing procedures. Said he wanted to make things right." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I didn't listen. I thought he was trying to renegotiate something. I was tired and I didn't have the patience for it. I sent him away." Clara absorbed that. "You think he was trying to warn you," she said. "I think he was scared and he picked a bad moment to say so, and I wasn't the man he needed me to be that day." He said it flatly without self-pity, which was somehow worse than if he'd made an excuse. "If I'd listened to him, then we'd have had a witness inside her operation 6 months ago. Can you get to him now?" Ethan shook his head. "He left Harlow 2 months ago. Nobody knows where he went." Clara thought about that. "He didn't leave," she said. "Men like that don't leave voluntarily. She moved him, or she frightened him into moving." She looked at Ethan. "Which means she knew you were starting to pay attention." "Or she knew something was coming," Ethan said. "Something that made having him around inconvenient. They looked at each other on the boardwalk, with the town moving around them, and what passed between them in that look was not alarm exactly, but a sharper kind of alertness, the recognition that the situation was more organized than they'd thought, and that somewhere someone had been watching the Caldwell Ranch more carefully than either of them had realized. "We need to go," Clara said. They were 2 miles from home when Ethan's gray gelding threw a shoe. It wasn't catastrophic. The horse was sound enough to walk slowly, and Ethan got down and checked the foot carefully and declared it clean, and they walked the remaining 2 miles with Clara on Dulcie and Ethan on foot beside the gray leading him, and the pace gave them time that neither of them had planned for. "Tell me about Eleanor," Clara said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out of the particular quality of that afternoon, the long walk, the slow rhythm of it, the feeling that they had just done something significant together, and the adrenaline was settling into something quieter. Ethan walked without answering for a moment. She thought perhaps she'd overstepped. Then he said, "What do you want to know?" "Whatever you want to tell," Clara said. Another pause. "She was from Indiana originally," he said. "Came west with her family when she was 16. Her father had the notion that Montana would make him rich. It didn't. But Eleanor liked it here. She said the sky was bigger." He walked. "We married when she was 20 and I was 26. She thought I was more settled than I was. I thought she was more patient than she was." He almost smiled. "We were both right, it turned out." "What did she love?" Clara asked. "Books," Ethan said without hesitation. "She had 32 of them, which was more than anyone in this county, and she lent them out and kept track of who had what in a little notebook. She knew which neighbors would return them and which ones she'd have to ask for." He was quiet for a moment. "She loved the first cold morning of fall. She said it smelled like something starting over." He paused. "She was better at people than I ever was. She'd bring in a neighbor who was struggling and feed them without making it feel like charity. She had that way of making people feel like they'd done her a favor by showing up. She sounds like someone who made the world easier for everyone around her," Clara said. "She did," Ethan said. "And I didn't tell her that enough." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm starting to think I have a habit of not saying things that need saying." Clara considered that. "You're saying them now," she said. He looked at her. "I suppose I am." They walked on. "What about your father?" Ethan asked. "What was he like beyond what I know?" Clara thought for a moment. "Stubborn," she said. "Unreasonably, magnificently stubborn. Once he decided something was right, there was no arguing him back from it." She paused. "He made decisions fast and trusted them completely. That drove me half wild sometimes. But he was right more often than not, so I learned to let him lead." She paused again. "Except when he was wrong. Then I told him, and we argued, and eventually he came around, but he never admitted I'd won." "Did that bother you?" "When I was younger," she said. "Not anymore. I figured out that his way of admitting I was right was to change. He just didn't like to say the words." She felt the familiar ache of him still close enough to feel. "I miss him every single day." Ethan nodded slowly. "I know," he said simply. They came through the gate in the low afternoon light, and Ethan took the horses to the barn, and Clara went to the house, and when she opened the kitchen door, she stopped. Someone had been inside. Not dramatically, nothing ransacked, nothing broken. But the papers on the kitchen table were not the way she'd left them. She kept them in a particular order, and they had been riffled and restacked without the care she used. The second crate had been moved 6 inches from where she always kept it. She stood in the doorway and took that in very carefully. Then she went to the tin box where the land grant documents lived. Empty. She was standing there with the empty tin box in her hands when Ethan came in from the barn. He read her face instantly. "What?" he said. Not a question. "The original land grant," she said. "It's gone." He went through the house fast and methodical, the way a man moves when he's done it before, checking every room, Every place. Something could be hidden or disturbed. His face completely controlled, while his eyes moved like something stripped to its function. Clara stood in the kitchen and breathed steadily, and did not allow herself to panic, because panic was not useful, and she had trained herself out of it years ago. Ethan came back. "Land grant," he said. "The deed. 2 years of branding records." "The boundary filing is recorded," Clara said immediately. Fitch stamped it. "I have the time. The originals matter less now that the county has the filing, but she doesn't know that," Ethan said. They looked at each other. "She thinks she's taken our proof," Clara said. "Yes. She doesn't know we made copies." "Where are the copies?" Ethan asked. "One set is in my room," Clara said, "under the floorboard." She watched something cross his face. "I moved them there 3 days ago, after she came to the house. I had a feeling." He stared at her. "You had a feeling," he said. "I've been wrong before," Clara said, "but not often." He went to her room, and she followed him, and she showed him where, and he lifted the board and looked at the neat package of documents wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into the dry space beneath, and he sat back on his heels and was quiet for a moment. "The second set?" he asked. "With Tom Briggs," Clara said. "I gave them to him the day we rode out. I told him to keep them somewhere separate from his own documents." Ethan looked at her. 3 days ago," he said. "Yes. Before she came to visit." "Yes." He stood up slowly. He looked at her in the doorway of her room, this small spare room with the hook on the back of the door, and the window that looked east, and whatever he was thinking moved across his face in a way she was getting better at reading. Though it still moved quietly in the deep current way of a man who felt things considerably more than he showed. "What made you think of it?" he asked. 3 days ago." "The fence," she said. "The repair on the eastern boundary. Someone had been out there, someone who knew exactly where the line was." She paused. "And the way Fitch looked at you when we filed. He'd seen your name on something before we got there. He knew we were coming." Ethan was very still. "She has someone watching the ranch," he said. "Had?" Clara said. "Now she thinks she's won, which gives us a little time." He nodded slowly, and then he did something she didn't expect. He laughed, just briefly, just a short, exhaled sound that was too dark to be entirely humorous, but was real, and it changed the whole structure of his face for a moment into something younger and less weathered. "My God," he said. "You're something else, Clara Whitmore." She felt heat rise to her face that she did not particularly welcome. "Someone had to think ahead," she said. "Yes," he said. "Someone did." He was looking at her differently again. Had been, she realized, since the ride back from the survey post, since the night at the kitchen table, since the 3 hours in the recorder's office where she'd watched him watch her work. The look was still careful. Ethan Caldwell did not look at anything carelessly. She'd figured that out in the first week. But there was something in it that hadn't been there before. She was not going to think about what that something was. Not right now. "We need to decide our next move before she figures out the filing stands," she said. He straightened up. "Back to business. What do you recommend?" "We go to Tom Briggs tonight. Tell him what happened. He needs to know the copies he's holding have become the primary documents." She thought for a moment. "And we need to send word to the territorial marshal. I mentioned it in Fitch's office on purpose. I wanted her to hear that we'd said it. But we need to actually do it now." "Nearest marshal's office is in Great Falls," Ethan said. 2-day ride. Can you send a letter that will move fast?" "I can send it with the Henderson boy. He rides the post route and he's fast and he doesn't talk." Ethan paused. "What do I say?" "I'll write it," Clara said. She sat down at the kitchen table, the same table with the papers slightly wrong. The evidence of a stranger's hands still faintly present in the disordered edges. And she wrote the letter to the territorial marshal's office with the same precision she brought to everything, laying out the financial irregularities, the boundary contest, The theft of documents from a private residence, naming Roy Prentice as a potential witness, naming Margaret Holloway as the common thread. She signed it and dated it and handed it to Ethan. He read it. "This is thorough," he said. "It needs to be," she said. "A marshal's office gets a lot of letters. This one has to make them come." He folded it carefully. "I'll get it to the Henderson boy tonight," he said. He stood there for a moment with the letter in his hand. "Clara, if she figures out the filing stands before the marshal responds—" "I know," Clara said. "She's not going to sit quietly. I know that too." She met his eyes. "We need to be ready for whatever she does next." What neither of them said, because saying it would make it more real than they were ready for, was that whatever Margaret Holloway did next was likely to be considerably less civilized than a visit and a theft. The Henderson boy left before dark. Ethan came back from seeing him off and found Clara at the stove making supper, which was new. She'd made breakfast, but generally he handled the evening meal such as it was. He stopped in the doorway. "You didn't have to," he said. "Sit down," she said. "You've been on your feet since before dawn." He sat down. She put a plate in front of him. Beans again, salt pork again, but with something added that smelled different, something with dried herbs she'd found in the back of the pantry, and she sat down with her own, and they ate, and the kitchen was warm and the lamp was steady, and outside the dark was coming down fast and final over the mountains. "I want to ask you something," Ethan said. "Ask. When this is over—" He stopped, seemed to find the sentence more complicated than he'd expected. "When the hearing is done, and the marshal has what he needs, and the boundary contest is dismissed, what do you want to do?" Clara looked at her plate. "What do you mean?" "I mean—" He set down his fork, looked at her directly. "You came here on a promise your father asked you to keep. You've kept it. More than kept it. When this is over, you'll have options. You could go anywhere. You're good enough at what you do that anyone would be lucky to have you." He paused. "I'm not trying to send you away. I'm trying to ask what you actually want. Not what you promised. Not what your father needed. What you want." Clara looked at the table for a moment. It was— She realized the first time anyone had asked her that question in longer than she could remember. Her father had always known what she needed, and he'd been right. But knowing what someone needs and asking what they want are two different questions. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I haven't let myself think about it." "Will you?" he asked. "Think about it." "Yes," she said. They finished their meal. She was washing the plates in the basin when Ethan said from the table, "I wrote to Eleanor's mother last year. Told her I was doing all right." He paused. "I wasn't. But I didn't know how to say otherwise." Clara kept washing. "She wrote back," he said. "Said she hoped I'd find a reason to open the house up again. Let some life back in." He was quiet. "I told her I'd think about it. I didn't think about it." "Are you thinking about it now?" Clara asked. A long pause. "Something like that," he said. She set the last plate down and dried her hands on the cloth by the basin and turned around to find him looking at her with that careful deep current look, and for the length of a breath, something that had been building quietly for 3 weeks occupied the room between them without either of them moving. Then a sound came from outside. Ethan was on his feet before Clara fully registered what she'd heard. Not a voice, not hoofbeats, but something lower. A crackling uneven with a smell that followed a half-second behind. He was at the door, and through it before she could speak. She followed. The barn. The south wall of the barn was burning. Not the slow smolder of a lamp accident. This was deliberate fast-moving fed from the bottom, where something had been placed to make it catch. Ethan was already running toward it, shouting back over his shoulder, "The horses, get them out!" And Clara ran without thinking, because the horses were inside, and she knew where Dulcie was, and she knew where the gray was, and she was not going to let them burn. She hit the barn door and shoved it open, and the smoke was already thick inside, low enough to breathe under, and she could hear the horses panicked in their stalls, not screaming yet, but close to it. that high, tight sound of animals who know something is wrong and wrong and wrong. "Easy," she said, and her voice was lower and steadier than she had any right to make it. "Easy, come on, come on." She got Dulcie's stall unlatched, and the mare came out hard, nearly knocking her sideways, and Clara grabbed the halter and got her moving toward the door. Outside. Good. Back inside for the gray, who was worse, swinging his head, eyes white-rimmed, and she talked him down with words that didn't matter, and hands that did, and she got him out the door 10 seconds before Ethan came around the far side of the barn with 2 more horses she hadn't known were there. They drove the animals clear. They stood together in the yard and watched the south wall burn, and then fight itself, and then slow, because Ethan had gotten water on the base of it in the first 2 minutes, and the night wind was not cooperating with whoever had set this. It didn't take the barn, but it had been meant to. Clara stood in the yard with her hands at her sides, and ash in her hair, and the smell of smoke in every breath, and she watched the last of the fire die under the water. Ethan poured, and she was not frightened exactly. She was something colder than frightened. She was certain. Ethan came to stand beside her. His face in the dying firelight was absolutely controlled, the way it went when he was feeling something large that he was holding very still. "She's escalating," Clara said. "Yes," he said. "She knows the filing stands." "Someone told her," he said, "between the recorder's office and tonight. Someone who was there." He looked at her. "Fitch." "Yes," Clara said. "She told him to move faster. And when she found out the documents were already recorded, she decided to send a different kind of message." Clara looked at the ruined south wall. She thought this would scare us, make us understand what it costs to fight her. Ethan looked at the barn. He looked at the horses standing in the far corner of the yard, still trembling, but safe. He looked at the house that was whole and lit behind them. Then he looked at Clara. She was standing in the ash and the dark with her hair loose where it had come undone, and her dress streaked with soot, and her face absolutely steady, and something moved across his face that was not the careful, contained thing she was used to from him. Something that came up through the control and past it. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice was different. "Yes," she said. "You went back in for the gray," he said. He was close to the wall that was burning. "You didn't..." He stopped. "You didn't wait." "He would have panicked," Clara said. "He needed someone calm." Clara. He took a step toward her and then seemed to catch himself and stood there with the word hanging between them without completion. She looked at him. "I'm all right," she said again, more gently this time. He nodded once. But he didn't step back. They stood together in the yard with the smoke drifting above them and the horses settling in the far corner, and the house holding its warmth behind them against the Montana dark. And what was between them now was no longer the careful, negotiated distance of a man who didn't want a wife and a woman who didn't want to be a burden. What was between them was something that had been built day by day, document by document, cup of coffee by cup of coffee, in the particular, slow, certain way of things that are meant to last. Neither of them said it, but neither of them pretended it wasn't there. "Come inside," Ethan said finally. "We need to talk about what happens tomorrow." "Yes," Clara said. She followed him in. Behind them, the last ember on the ruined wall died out in the dark, and somewhere 3 miles away, in a house considerably larger and colder than the Caldwell kitchen, a woman who had believed she was dealing with a lonely rancher and a frightened girl was beginning to understand that she had made a serious mistake. She just didn't know yet how serious. They sat at the kitchen table until past midnight. Clara made fresh coffee without asking and set it between them, and Ethan didn't comment on it, which was how things worked between them. Now the small domestic gestures had stopped requiring acknowledgement because they'd become part of the rhythm of the house, as natural as the way the floorboard near the back door creaked or the way the lamp in the kitchen burned slightly lower on the left side. "She's done waiting," Ethan said. "Yes," Clara said. "The theft was a warning. The fire was an escalation. She expected one of them to be enough." "Neither was." "No." Clara wrapped both hands around her cup. Which means the next move is bigger. Or faster. Or both. She looked at him. Who else in this valley has she done this to? Ethan was quiet for a moment. There were 3 ranchers who sold land to her in the past 4 years, he said slowly. All of them along the river. At the time it seemed like bad luck. A hard year. A decision that made sense. He paused. Frank Deller sold his south pasture in '81. Said the water rights were more trouble than they were worth. Jim Caswell sold his eastern 40 in '82. Said his survey showed some kind of error. He stopped. Clara looked at him. Survey error, she said. Ethan's jaw tightened. Same as mine. Did they fight it? No. Frank couldn't afford a lawyer, and Jim had a sick wife and 3 children, and no time to stand in a courtroom. Ethan set down his cup. She picked them because they were alone, and stretched thin, and had no one to sit at a table and go through their own records with them. She picked you for the same reason, Clara said. Not unkindly. Just the truth laid flat. Yes, he said. We need to talk to them, Clara said. Frank Deller and Jim Caswell, before the hearing. Why? Because if the same pattern exists in their records, the short weighing the inflated supply costs the manufactured survey errors, then what we're presenting to the marshal isn't one man's complaint. It's a pattern of deliberate fraud across multiple properties. She met his eyes. That's a different kind of case. That's the kind of case that ends someone's operation entirely. Ethan was quiet, thinking it through. Frank won't be easy, he said. He's proud. He sold that land and he told himself it was his own decision, and he's been living with that story for 3 years. I know, Clara said. But he's a proud man who was deceived, not a proud man who made a mistake. There's a difference, and if you explain it to him the right way, he'll hear it. And Jim? Does Jim Caswell still have his records from that period? Ethan thought. Jim's wife kept everything. Marion. She's the most organized person I know after... He stopped, started again. She keeps everything. Then Jim Caswell is first, Clara said. Tomorrow morning early, before Margaret has time to realize we're building something larger than she thought. Ethan looked at her across the kitchen table in the late-night quiet, and what crossed his face was not admiration exactly, or not only that, but something more specific, the look of a man recognizing a quality he respects and has rarely encountered. You think like a general, he said. My father used to say, I thought like a trapper, Clara said. Set the line right and let the quarry walk into it. He wasn't wrong, Ethan said. He usually wasn't, Clara said. Sleep. We need to be at the Caswell place by 7. He stood up. He paused at the door to the hallway. Clara, he said. She looked up. You went into a burning barn tonight, he said. For my horses. Your horses and Dulcie, she said. Dulcie's mine by now, I think. She's decided. Something moved in his face. When this is over, he said. And then he stopped himself, and the sentence hung there unfinished in the warm kitchen air. When it's over, she said carefully. We'll have time to talk about all of it. He nodded once. He went to bed. Clara sat alone for a few minutes more, drinking the last of her coffee, listening to the house settle around her, thinking about what came next, and trying not to think about the way he'd said, when this is over, with a weight in it that had nothing to do with land fraud. Jim Caswell was a lean, weathered man of about 50 who answered his door at 7:10, with the expression of someone who'd been awake for hours already and wasn't entirely surprised to see Ethan Caldwell on his porch, though he was clearly surprised by the woman beside him. Ethan, he said. Jim, Ethan said. This is Clara. She's with me. He said it without hesitation, and Clara registered the absence of any qualifying phrase. Not my wife, or a woman helping me, or anything that reduced her function to something tidy. Just, she's with me. Jim looked at her. He looked at the oilcloth-wrapped bundle she was carrying. He stepped back from the door. Come in. Marion Caswell was exactly as organized as Ethan had suggested. She produced her records from 1882 inside 8 minutes of Clara asking for them, A neat wooden box with dividers, every invoice and sale record and letter organized by month and year. She set them on the table without being asked twice and sat down beside Clara with the expression of a woman who has been waiting without knowing it for someone to come and look at these particular papers. Clara went through them in under an hour. The pattern was there. Same short weighing at the stockyard. Not Roy Prentice, a different man, but the same technique, the same percentage. The same inflated supply costs from Millard's starting within 2 months of the survey contest that had eventually forced Jim to sell his Eastern 40 at a price considerably below what it was worth. When Clara set down her pen and looked at Jim Caswell, he was sitting very still with his hands flat on the table and an expression that was some particular combination of anger and the sick specific feeling of a man who has just understood that something he blamed himself for was not his fault. "She did this to us," he said. His voice was quiet. "It wasn't the drought. It wasn't my management." "No," Clara said. "She made sure you were too stretched to fight the survey contest. The financial pressure was deliberate." Jim looked at Ethan. "I sold that land for $400, he said. "I know," Ethan said. "Water rights on that stretch of river are worth twice that at minimum." "Jim," Clara said, "I want you to consider being part of the filing to the territorial marshal. Your records alongside Ethan's, alongside whatever Frank Deller has, this becomes a case the marshal's office cannot ignore." She paused. "I can't promise you recover what you lost, but I can promise that if we do this right, she will not do it to anyone else." Jim Caswell looked at his wife. Marion Caswell looked at Clara with sharp, assessing eyes. "You put this together?" Marion asked. "All of it." "Most of it," Clara said. "Where'd you come from?" "Wyoming," Clara said. "My father was Thomas Whitmore." Marion's expression shifted into something Clara couldn't entirely read. "Tom Whitmore's girl," she said. "Lord." She looked at Ethan. "Your luck changed when she walked through your gate, Ethan Caldwell." Ethan said nothing, but he didn't disagree. "We'll join the filing," Jim said. Frank Deller was harder. He was 57 and bitter in the particular way of a man who had worked for 30 years and lost something he could never rebuild. And he met them at his gate rather than his door, which was its own kind of message. "Ethan," he said. He looked at Clara without warmth. "I've heard about you." "I imagine," Clara said. "Town says you're here to take what you can get from a lonely man," Frank said, blunt, testing. Clara met his eyes squarely. "The town doesn't know why I'm here," she said. "And it's not that." "What is it then?" "It's the same thing that's kept you angry for 3 years, she said. "Margaret Holloway." Frank's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "I sold that land," he said. "That was my decision." "It was," Clara said. "Made under financial pressure that was manufactured specifically to force that decision. I have the records to prove it." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not here to tell you what to do, Mr. Deller. I'm here to show you what was done to you. What you decide to do with that is your own business." Frank looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Ethan. "You believe her?" he asked. "I've seen the records," Ethan said. "Yes." Frank opened the gate. He didn't say anything, but he opened it. They had 3 ranchers' records and 3 names and a pattern of fraud that went back 5 years by the time they got back to the Caldwell Ranch in the late afternoon. Clara sat at the kitchen table and built the supplemental filing while Ethan tended to the horses, and when he came in and looked over her shoulder at what she'd assembled, he said, "That's everything." "Not quite," Clara said. "We're still missing Roy Prentice." "He's gone, Clara. Men who run from something don't always run far," she said. "And men who try to do the right thing once will usually try again if they feel safe enough." She paused. "If the marshal comes and opens an investigation, Prentice becomes a witness. He'll surface." Ethan was quiet. "You've thought all of this through," he said. I've been thinking about it since the first night, Clara said. Since I looked at your records and saw the pattern. I just needed the evidence to catch up with what I already knew. He pulled out the chair beside her and sat down, not across from her, which was where he always sat, but beside her, which was different, and they were both aware of it. When the marshal comes, he said, they're going to ask how you found all of this. An unmarried woman going through a rancher's accounts. We're married, Clara said. He looked at her. We should be, she said with the same calm, practical tone she used for everything, which was the only tone she trusted herself to use right now, because the other tone, the one that lived underneath, was not something she was ready to let out. It simplifies the legal standing considerably. A wife has rights to household records. An unmarried woman helping a neighbor has a much more complicated position. Is that the only reason? Ethan asked. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at the paper in front of her. No, she said. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. Harlow has a justice of the peace, Ethan said finally, his voice careful and level. He marries people on Saturdays. That's 2 days from now, Clara said. Yes, Ethan said. All right, Clara said. She picked up her pen. She kept writing. Beside her, Ethan reached across and moved the ink bottle 2 inches closer to her hand without saying anything, because he had noticed 3 weeks ago that she always had to reach for it, and he had just now decided to do something about it. Clara noticed. She didn't say anything either, but she thought that Thomas Whitmore, wherever he was probably smiling. The hearing before the county recorder was scheduled for the following Wednesday, 4 days away, and the morning before it, something happened that changed everything again. The Henderson boy came back. He arrived at the gate at 7 in the morning, his horse blown with a letter he said he'd ridden through the night to deliver because the man who gave it to him said it was urgent and paid him accordingly. He handed it to Ethan and rode off to water his horse at the trough, and Ethan brought it inside and set it on the table in front of Clara. The seal was the territorial marshal's office in Great Falls. Clara opened it. She read it. She set it down. Roy Prentice walked into the marshal's office in Great Falls 8 days ago, she said. He came forward voluntarily. He has a sworn statement implicating Margaret Holloway in a coordinated scheme of fraudulent land acquisition going back 6 years. She looked up at Ethan. He didn't run. He went straight to the marshal. Ethan stared at her. He was trying to do the right thing all along, Clara said. He tried to tell you. When you weren't ready to hear it, he went to find someone who would be. The expression on Ethan's face was something she'd never seen from him before. Not quite guilt, but the close cousin of it, the look of a man reckoning with a moment he'd handled badly and its consequences. He could have been bought off, Ethan said, or scared into staying quiet. He wasn't. No, Clara said. I turned him away, Ethan said. Yes, Clara said. And he went and did what needed doing anyway. She paused. That's not on you, Ethan. He made his own choice. I made mine too, Ethan said. You did. And then you made different ones. She met his eyes. That's what matters. The letter also said the marshal would arrive in Harlow by Friday. It said they should make no moves before then and should document any further incidents, the fire, the theft in writing signed and dated. Clara had already done that. She handed Ethan her documentation of both incidents when he asked. He looked at it and then looked at her with that expression again, the one she was starting to recognize as the version of Ethan Caldwell that existed when he stopped managing himself quite so carefully. Is there anything you haven't thought of? He asked. Probably, she said, but I haven't found it yet. They were married on Saturday morning. It was not a large affair. Tom Briggs came because he was the closest thing either of them had to a witness of standing, and Jim and Marion Caswell came because Marion had decided in the way of certain women that this was an event she intended to be present for, regardless of whether she'd been specifically invited. Frank Deller did not come, but he sent a jar of good honey with the Henderson boy, which Clara thought was exactly right. The justice of the peace was a small round man named Howard, who smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, and performed the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done it many times and still found it worthwhile. He asked the words, and they said the words back, and when it was done, and Howard said, Ethan could kiss his bride, there was a moment. Just a moment where Ethan looked at Clara with something private and careful in his expression, and then he leaned forward and pressed his lips to her cheek, and she felt the warmth of it move through her like the first real heat of a fire after a long cold. Marion Caswell made a quiet sound of satisfaction. Tom Briggs shook Ethan's hand and then unexpectedly took Clara's hand in both of his and said, "Your father would be very pleased, young lady." Clara's throat tightened. "Thank you," she said. "I hope so." Afterward, on the ride home, they were quiet for a long time. Not the early silence that had been about two people managing distance, but the new kind, the kind that had room in it. "How do you feel?" Ethan asked. Clara thought about it honestly. "Like something settled," she said. "Like a thing that was uncertain is less uncertain now." "Yes," Ethan said. "That's about right." He reached across and she wasn't expecting it, but his hand found hers where it rested on the saddle horn and covered it briefly with a warmth that was more certain than anything he'd said in weeks. And then he took his hand back and they rode on. And the thing that had been between them in the kitchen a week ago, unnamed and careful, had a shape now that neither of them needed to describe. Marshal David Holt arrived in Harlow on Friday afternoon, 2 days after the marriage and 3 days before the scheduled hearing, and he was not what Clara had been expecting. She had expected someone procedural, someone who would need to be managed, explained to, guided carefully through the documentation. She had written the letter specifically to compel, specifically to make the case so clear that inaction would be difficult, and she'd assumed she'd need to make it again in person. Holt was 52, former cavalry, with a manner that was as direct as a hammer and twice as efficient. He read Clara's full submission in 30 minutes, sitting at the Caldwell kitchen table, the same table where all of this had begun, and when he looked up, he looked at Clara, not at Ethan. "You built this," he said. "With my husband's records and the assistance of 2 other ranchers," Clara said. "Yes. Prentice's statement matches yours on every point of fact," Holt said. He set the papers down. "I've been looking at Margaret Holloway for 2 years. She's been careful enough that we haven't had anything solid to move on." He paused. "This is solid." Clara felt something ease in her chest that had been tight since the night of the fire. "What happens now?" Ethan asked. "I execute a search warrant on Holloway's property and business records," Holt said. "I take statements from Deller and Caswell. I make sure the recorder's office understands they're under review as well, specifically Mr. Fitch." He looked at Ethan. "Your boundary hearing proceeds as scheduled. With Prentice's testimony and the survey documentation, the contest doesn't have a leg to stand on." "And Margaret?" Clara asked. Holt looked at her steadily. "That depends on what we find in the search." He paused. "But I'll tell you plainly, Mrs. Caldwell, based on what's in front of me today, I expect we'll find enough." Mrs. Caldwell. It was the first time someone had called her that. Clara did not look at Ethan, but she felt him not looking at her either, that particular aware stillness that was its own kind of communication. "There's one more thing," Clara said. She reached into the oilcloth bundle and pulled out a sheet of paper she'd been sitting on for 4 days, waiting for the right moment. "I found this in the second crate, the one Ethan hadn't been through." She set it in front of Holt. He looked at it. His expression changed. "Where did you find this?" he asked. His voice was careful in a new way. "In a crate of unreviewed records," Clara said. "It's a letter, from Aldous Fitch to Margaret Holloway, dated 8 months ago." She paused, discussing the Caldwell boundary contest before it was filed. The room was absolutely still. "Before it was filed," Holt repeated. 6 weeks before it was filed," Clara said. "He's not just in her pocket. He was in on the planning." Holt looked at the letter for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara with an expression that was professional admiration stripped to its bones. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, How long have you been doing this kind of work? I've been keeping account since I was 12, Clara said. I've been doing this for about 6 weeks. Holt sat back. He almost smiled. All right, he said. Here's what we're going to do. The hearing on Wednesday was not what Margaret Holloway had planned for. She arrived at the county recorder's office with her lawyer, a man from Billings named Cartwright, who wore expensive boots and had the confidence of someone who had never lost a proceeding in a county courthouse. He looked at Ethan when they came in, and the look said he expected this to be brief. Then he saw Marshal Holt standing near the back wall. The confidence recalibrated slightly. Then Cartwright saw Tom Briggs' survey documentation already submitted and stamped, and the original land grant and the 3 other ranchers' records spread across the table, and the supplemental filing that Clara had built over 3 weeks of careful, methodical, relentless work. The confidence did something else entirely. Clara stood at the table. Ethan stood beside her. The room was fuller than anyone had expected. Jim and Marion Caswell were there. Frank Deller was there standing near the back with his arms crossed, and an expression that was part anger and part something that looked like relief. Tom Briggs was there. 3 other Valley residents whose names Clara didn't know yet, but whose presence said they had opinions about Margaret Holloway that they'd been keeping to themselves. Aldous Fitch was not presiding. He had been quietly replaced by his younger clerk, who looked frightened and earnest, and was doing his very best. Margaret Holloway sat across the room with Cartwright beside her, and her hands folded, and her face composed into the pleasant architectural expression Clara had seen the first day she came to call. But the eyes were different. The eyes had the quality of a woman doing rapid calculations and not entirely liking the results. Clara began. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform. She simply laid out what she had in the same sequence she'd built it, the way her father had taught her. Let the numbers tell the story, because numbers don't have reasons to lie. She walked through the short weighing at the stockyard, the dates, the percentages, the names of the ranchers affected. She walked through the inflated supply costs and the falsified invoices. She walked through the survey contest and Tom Briggs's independent verification of the boundary post. She presented the letter from Fitch to Holloway dated 6 weeks before the contest was filed, and when she set that on the table, she heard someone at the back of the room draw a sharp breath. Cartwright objected 3 times. Each time Clara answered the objection with a specific document and a specific date and a specific number, and after the 3rd time, Cartwright went quiet in the way of a man who has realized that he does not actually know more about this case than the woman he's arguing with. Margaret Holloway looked at Clara across the room. Clara looked back at her. For the length of a breath, something passed between them. Not quite acknowledgement, not quite respect, but the particular honesty of 2 people who understand each other completely and have chosen different ways to live. Then the clerk stamped the response filing as accepted, and the boundary contest was suspended, pending the marshal's investigation, and Holt stepped forward and said the words that made Cartwright put his pen away, and Margaret Holloway's hands still folded. Go very slightly, white at the knuckles. When it was over, Ethan took Clara's arm on the boardwalk outside, not in the deliberate way of a man making a statement, but in the natural, unconscious way of a man whose hand found something and knew it was where it belonged. Frank Deller stopped beside them. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at Clara. You know what the worst part was, he said finally. I always knew something was wrong. I knew those numbers weren't right. I just didn't know how to... He stopped. I didn't have anyone to sit across from me and tell me I wasn't crazy for thinking so. You weren't crazy, Clara said. No, Frank said. He looked at Ethan. She's something your wife. I know it, Ethan said. Frank nodded once. He walked away. Tom Briggs shook both their hands, held Clara's a beat longer. Marion Caswell embraced her, which Clara hadn't expected, and which made her eyes sting in a way she covered by looking up at the sky for a moment and breathing steadily. On the ride home, Ethan said nothing for a long time. Then, what was your father like when he won an argument? Clara thought about it. Quiet, she said. He'd get very quiet. He said gloating was for people who were surprised by their own success. Ethan was quiet. "I'm not surprised by yours," he said. Clara looked at him. "I was surprised the first morning," he admitted. "The feed prices the first day." He glanced at her. "After that, I started to understand what I was working with." "And what is that?" she asked. He considered it. "Someone who sees what's actually there," he said, "instead of what people expect to be there." He looked at her steadily. "That's rarer than you think." Clara looked at the road ahead. "My father saw it," she said. "Yes," Ethan said. "He did." The investigation moved fast from there, the way things move when a federal marshal is involved, and there is paper to back everything up. Roy Prentice came back to Harlow under protection and gave his formal statement, and what he said extended the case considerably further than even Clara had anticipated. There were 2 other counties, 2 other patterns. Years of quiet, calculated land acquisition funded by the kind of fraud that was small enough to miss if you were one person standing alone but enormous, once you laid all the pieces beside each other. Fitch resigned before he was formally charged. He left Harlow on a Tuesday morning with a bag and a haunted look, and the particular hunched posture of a man who has known for some time that a reckoning was coming and has spent the intervening period hoping it wouldn't. It came. Margaret Holloway's lawyer negotiated terms that kept her from the worst outcome, but not from consequence. The land she had acquired through manipulated contests was subject to review. Restitution to the affected ranchers was structured into an agreement that Holt described to Clara when she asked as better than most outcomes and not as good as justice. "That's usually how it goes," Clara said. "Yes," Holt said. He looked at her across the desk in the temporary office he'd set up at the Harlow Hotel. "You should consider whether there's a formal application of what you do, Mrs. Caldwell. What you put together in 6 weeks, I've seen trained investigators take 6 months to assemble." "I kept accounts," Clara said. "And I paid attention." "That's what investigation is," Holt said. Clara thought about that later. Riding home on Dulcie in the early evening, the case largely closed around them, and the world rearranging itself into whatever came next. She thought about her father. She thought about what he'd known when he sent her here. Not just that Ethan was a good man who needed someone, but that Clara needed somewhere she could be entirely what she was, without apology, and without the constant management of other people's expectations. A place where paying attention was not an eccentricity, but a contribution. Where being her father's daughter was an asset rather than a curiosity. Thomas Whitmore had been many things. He had been above all right. She was still thinking about it when she came through the gate and found Ethan on the porch, which was where he sat sometimes in the evenings when the work was done and the quiet was good. He stood up when she rode in and came to take Dulcie's reins while she dismounted, and when she was down he didn't immediately lead the horse away. He stood there. "How'd it go with Holt?" he asked. "Done," she said. "Substantially done. He'll be in the county another week, but the main case is made." She looked at him. "It's over." He nodded. "Ethan," she said. He waited. "2 weeks ago you asked me what I wanted," she said. "When this was over." "I remember," he said. "I've been thinking about it," she said. He was very still. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because I have nowhere else, not because of the promise I made, because—" She stopped. And then she made herself say it, because she was Thomas Whitmore's daughter, and Thomas Whitmore had not raised her to leave important things unsaid. "Because in 6 weeks, this has become the only place I want to be, and you have become the main reason why." The evening was going quiet around them. Ethan looked at her. He looked at her for long enough that she felt the full weight of his attention, which was considerable, which was the kind of attention that didn't get divided or deflected. Then he said, "I told Eleanor's mother I'd open the house back up. Let some life back in." "I know," Clara said. "You told me. I think," he said slowly, "that I didn't understand what that meant until you knocked on my gate." He took a breath, not steadying himself, Something more deliberate than that. I'm not good at saying the things that matter. Eleanor told me that. You haven't told me yet, but I suspect you've noticed. I've noticed, Clara said. I'm going to try to be better at it, he said. That's not a promise I make lightly. I know, she said. I love you, he said. I think I have since the morning you told me about Dawson's feed prices. He said it with the slightly rueful directness of a man who has just admitted something that's been true for longer than is entirely comfortable. That's probably a strange place to start. Clara felt something move through her that was the complete and overwhelming opposite of loneliness. My father, she said, told me once that love usually starts with one person seeing another person clearly. Not the version they want to see, the actual person. She looked at him. You've seen me clearly since the first week. You're not hard to see, Ethan said, when you let a person look. She reached out and took his hand. He looked down at their hands. Then he looked up at her, and the face that the town called cold and the valley called closed, and 4 years of grief had made so careful, was none of those things right now. It was open and certain and present, in the way of a man who has stopped managing his own feelings long enough to simply have them. Come inside, Clara said. I'll make supper. You don't have to. I want to, she said. She led Dulcie to the barn herself, and he walked beside her, and the house waited with its lamp already burning in the kitchen window, and the land around them was quiet, in the particular way that land gets quiet, when the thing that needed to happen has happened and everything else can rest. Inside the kitchen, Clara put water on for coffee, and got the pan from the hook, and started cutting, and Ethan sat at the table in his chair, which was the chair to the left, and she worked at the stove, which was where she worked, and the domestic geography of it was so natural and settled and right, that Clara thought for a moment her throat might close completely. She kept cutting. Clara, Ethan said. She looked over her shoulder. Thank you, he said, for keeping your father's promise. He paused. And for making a few of your own. She turned back to the stove. She did not trust her voice entirely, so she said nothing, but she was smiling. And in the kitchen that had held only silence for 4 years, the sound of supper being made for 2 people who intended to go on making it together for a very long time was the only sound that needed to be there. The restitution orders came through on a Thursday in late October, 6 weeks after the hearing, and Ethan read the marshal's letter at the kitchen table with Clara sitting across from him, drinking her morning coffee. And when he set it down, he was quiet in the way that meant something large was moving through him that he was finding words for. Frank Deller gets his south pasture back, he said, or the assessed value of it at current prices his choice. What will he choose? Clara asked. The land, Ethan said without hesitation. Frank would take the land over money every time. He was born on that property. And Jim, cash settlement. Marion will want the flexibility. He set the letter down. And our Eastern 40 stands. Boundary confirmed. Contest dismissed with prejudice, which means she can't refile. Clara wrapped both hands around her cup. Outside, the first real cold of approaching winter was making itself known in the way the house held its breath against the morning. But the kitchen was warm, and the lamp was steady, and the coffee was good. And this particular ordinary moment was, Clara thought, exactly what her father had been trying to give her when he wrote that letter. Not rescue. Not security exactly. A place where ordinary mornings felt like enough. There's something else in the letter, Ethan said. She looked at him. Holt wants to know if you'd be willing to consult, he said carefully, on future investigations. He's specific about it. He says the kind of document analysis you did on this case is something his office has a continuing need for, and he'd rather hire someone who's already demonstrated they can do it than train someone from scratch. He looked at her across the table. It would mean some travel, Billings probably. Great Falls when the caseload requires it. Clara was very still. He's offering me work, she said. Paid work, Ethan said, with the Territorial Marshal's office. He held her gaze. How do you feel about that? She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. I feel like my father is somewhere laughing, she said. Ethan almost smiled. Is that a yes?" "It's a yes," she said. He nodded once, the way he nodded when something settled correctly into its place. Then he picked up his coffee and drank it and said, "I'll need to hire someone to help with the accounts here when you're away." "I'll train them before I go anywhere," Clara said. "I know you will," he said. That was all. That was, Clara thought, exactly all it needed to be. The winter came down hard that year. The way Montana winters came down, not gradually, but all at once, like a decision, the cold arriving in a single night and staying. Ethan had spent 15 years learning how this ranch behaved in winter, and he moved through the heavy work of it with an efficiency that Clara admired from the particular angle of someone who was also working just differently. She rebuilt his filing system entirely. It took 3 weeks, and the kitchen table was covered in organized chaos for most of that time. But when she was done, every record from the past 5 years was reconstructed, reconciled, and cross-referenced, and the projections for the coming year accounted for the actual costs rather than the inflated ones they'd been paying. On the evening she finished, she called Ethan in from the barn and showed him. He stood behind her chair and looked at the ledger for a long time. "This is what the ranch actually earns," she said, "after real supply costs and realistic cattle prices. It's not the number you thought it was." He looked at the bottom figure. He paused. "That's better than I thought." "Yes," Clara said. "She was bleeding you, but she hadn't broken you. The ranch is sound, Ethan. It's more than sound." She looked up at him over her shoulder. "You built something real here." He looked at the number for another moment. Then he put his hand on her shoulder, just briefly, just the warm, steady weight of it, and said, "We built something real here." She put her hand over his. Just for a moment. Then she turned back to the ledger and said, "Now, about the spring cattle purchase. I think we can afford to increase the herd by 12 to 15 head. If we approach the Dawson supplier early and negotiate—" "Clara," he said. She stopped. "It's 8 o'clock at night," he said. "I know, but if we—" "The ledger will be there in the morning," he said. He pulled out the chair beside her, the one he'd started using, the beside her chair rather than the across from her chair. "Come sit with me, just for a while." She looked at the ledger. She looked at him. She closed the ledger. "Just for a while," she said. They sat at the kitchen table with no papers between them for the first time since she'd arrived, and Ethan poured 2 small glasses of the whiskey he kept for occasions, and set one in front of her, and the fire in the stove spoke quietly to itself. And outside the winter pressed against the house, and inside was warm and still, and theirs. "Tell me something I don't know about you," Ethan said. Clara thought. "I used to want to be a teacher," she said. "When I was young, before I understood what I was actually good at." She paused. "What about you?" "I wanted to see the Pacific Ocean," he said. "Still do." She looked at him. "You've never been?" "No." "We should go," she said. "When the spring work is done. It's not so far by rail now." He looked at her as though the idea had arrived from somewhere he hadn't known to look. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They drank their whiskey. The fire talked to itself. Neither of them said anything else for a long time, and the silence between them was the comfortable, deep kind, the kind you couldn't manufacture and couldn't rush. The kind that only existed between people who had been through something real together and come out the other side, still choosing each other. Roy Prentice came to see them in December. He arrived on a gray afternoon with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who has been carrying something heavy long enough that he's forgotten what it feels like to put it down. Ethan let him in without ceremony, and Clara made coffee without being asked, and they sat at the kitchen table, the table that had become over these months the place where all the serious things happened. "I should have come to you sooner," Prentice said. He was talking to Ethan, but he looked at the table. "After you sent me away that spring, I thought about quitting, just leaving. I had enough to be afraid of without—" He stopped. "But I kept thinking about the other ranchers. What was being done? what I was part of, whether I wanted to be or not. He finally looked up. I'm sorry it took me as long as it did. You went to the marshal, Ethan said, when it mattered. I should have gone sooner. Yes, Ethan said with the honesty that was simply his nature. But you went. Prentice looked at Clara. The marshal's office told me what you built, what you found in the records. He shook his head slowly. She was careful. She was so careful. I didn't think anyone would ever be able to prove it. The numbers were always there, Clara said. She just relied on everyone being too busy and too tired and too alone to look at them together. She was right, Prentice said. Until she wasn't. He looked at his coffee cup. What happens to her now? She keeps most of what she legitimately built, Clara said. The fraudulent acquisitions are under review. Fitch faces a formal inquiry. She pays restitution, and she operates under a level of scrutiny she's never had before. She paused. It's not everything. It's more than nothing, Prentice said. Yes, Clara agreed. It's considerably more than nothing. He left an hour later lighter, in the way of a man who has said what needed saying to the people who needed to hear it. Ethan stood on the porch watching him ride out, and Clara stood beside him in the cold. And after a moment Ethan said, He's a decent man who got caught in something too big. Yes, Clara said. I should have listened to him in the spring. You're listening now, Clara said. That matters too. He looked at her. You don't let me stay guilty very long, he said. You were never guilty of anything except being tired and alone, and doing too much without enough help, she said. That's not a character flaw. That's just a circumstance. She looked out at the yard at the barn, with its repaired south wall at the fence line running clean and straight to the east. Circumstances change. They do, he said. He took her hand. Not briefly this time. He kept it. They stood on the porch in the December cold with their breath clouding in the air, and the winter pressing down on everything, and the warmth of the house at their backs. And Clara thought that this exact moment was the thing her father had been trying to give her when he was dying and scared for her and reaching for any solid thing he could find. He had found Ethan Caldwell. And Ethan Caldwell, it turned out, was exactly solid enough. Spring came. The way it always comes to Montana, reluctantly at first. Then all at once the cold breaking overnight, and the ground coming back to itself in a rush of mud and green that felt like an argument the land had been winning quietly all winter. Ethan bought 12 new head of cattle using the figures from Clara's projections, negotiated at Dawson's supply post for the winter feed contract 6 months early, at a price that made the owner blink twice, and hired a young man named Caleb from a neighboring ranch to help with the expanded herd. Clara trained Caleb on the accounts for 2 weeks before she left for Billings. She sat with him at the kitchen table, the same way her father had sat with her patient, and specific showing, rather than just telling, making him work through the reconciliation himself while she watched and corrected. On the last evening before she left, Caleb looked at the ledger and then at her and said, "You're real particular about this." "Numbers deserve to be particular," Clara said. "A number written sloppily is a number that can be argued with." Caleb nodded with the expression of someone filing away a lesson. Clara looked at him and thought about the teacher she'd wanted to be at 12 years old, and thought that maybe she'd been one all along, just not in a schoolroom. Ethan drove her to the station himself the next morning. He didn't say much on the way, which was how he handled things that mattered. He got quieter, not louder. At the station, he carried her bag to the platform and stood beside her, waiting for the train, and the silence between them was the one she'd learned to read, the one that said a great deal precisely by saying nothing. 3 days, she said. Maybe 4, if Holt needs more time on the second set of records. I know, he said. Caleb knows where everything is. Clara, he said. She looked at him. I know, he said again differently. Meaning you don't need to arrange everything before you go. Meaning I trust you to come back. Meaning I'll be here. The train whistled in the distance. She reached up and touched his face, just her hand. Just a moment, the warmth of his jaw against her palm, and he caught her hand and held it there briefly. And then the train was pulling in, with its noise and its steam and its enormous indifference to every small human thing happening on the platform, and he let her go. She found her seat. She looked out the window as the train pulled away, and he was standing on the platform in the morning light, hat in hand, watching her go, and his face had all the things in it that he'd been learning to show, the things he'd kept sealed for 4 years, because grief had made showing them feel dangerous, and that she had, without entirely meaning to, taught him to let out again. She pressed her hand to the glass. He raised his. And then the train curved, and he was gone, and she faced forward and breathed steadily, and was not sad, because being apart from someone you intend to return to is a completely different thing from being alone. She knew the difference now. The Billings work took 4 days. Holt had 2 cases he wanted her eyes on: a mining company's supply records, with the same pattern of systematic inflation she'd found in Ethan's accounts, and a land dispute involving a fraudulent deed that the territorial court had been unable to untangle from the legitimate title chain. Clara worked at a desk in the marshal's temporary office, and ate her meals at the hotel, and slept adequately, and thought about Ethan more than she'd expected to, not in a worrying way, but in the warm, persistent way of someone whose thoughts kept returning to a place they wanted to be. On the 3rd day, Holt sat across from her while she was working and said, "You should have been doing this professionally years ago." "I was doing it for my father," she said. "That counts." "It does," he said. "But you could have been getting paid for it." Clara set down her pen. "Marshal Holt," she said. "Until 6 months ago, I didn't have anywhere to do it from. A woman without a household isn't taken seriously in any official capacity in this territory, and you know that as well as I do." "I do," he said. He looked at her directly. "That's why I'm telling you in writing formally that the Territorial Marshal's office considers you a qualified investigative consultant. That's a designation with legal standing. It means when you walk into a county recorder's office with documents, you have an official capacity to present them." Clara looked at him. "You can't give a woman that authority," she said. "Not arguing, just stating the fact of the world as it was." "I'm not giving you anything," Holt said. "I'm recognizing what you already demonstrated. There's a difference." He leaned forward. "The law is what I say it is in this territory, Mrs. Caldwell, within the federal mandate. And I'm saying this." Clara thought about her father. She thought about what he'd believed she was capable of, and how he'd been right, and how the best thing he'd ever done for her was refuse to pretend otherwise, even when the world did. "All right," she said. She picked up her pen. She went back to work. She came home on a Saturday evening to find the house lit and warm and something on the stove that smelled considerably better than Ethan's usual efforts, which told her either Marion Caswell had been by, or Ethan had been applying himself to something he'd decided was worth learning. She came through the door, and he was at the stove with his sleeves rolled up and a dish towel over his shoulder, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has been waiting in a way he would not entirely admit to. 4 days, he said. "I said maybe 4, she said. "You did," he said. He looked her over in the assessing way, checking that she was well, that the travel hadn't worn her, that everything was as it should be. "How'd it go?" "Holt has given me a formal designation," she said. "Investigative consultant. It has legal standing." Ethan stopped stirring. He turned around fully. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put both arms around her and held her, which was new, not the hand on shoulder or the hand held, or the brief warmth of his mouth on her cheek, but fully properly, the way a man holds someone he is deeply glad to have back. She let herself be held. She put her face against his neck and breathed, and the smell of him was wood smoke and soap and the particular human warmth of someone who had been working all day, and it was the best thing she'd breathed since the train pulled out of Harlow 4 days ago. "Your father knew," he said quietly into her hair. "He always knew," she said. They stood in the kitchen for a moment. That was its own kind of complete. Then Ethan said, Supper's going to burn." Clara laughed. It surprised her, the ease of it, the way it came up without any effort, and she pulled back and looked at him, and he was looking at her with that open face, the one she'd been watching him find his way back to. And it was so different from the closed, careful man who'd stood in a ranch yard with a saddle on his arm 6 months ago that she would barely have recognized him. She recognized him now. She recognized him completely. "Go sit down," he said. "I'll bring it." "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "Go sit down." She sat down. He brought supper. It was actually good, a beef stew, slow cooked with biscuits that had come out right for once, and she said so. And he said. Marion Caswell had written out the method in very specific terms and suggested he practice it while Clara was gone, and the fact that he had was the kind of thing that settled somewhere deep and warm and stayed there. Jim Caswell came to see them in April with his hat in his hands, and his eyes bright in a way Clara hadn't seen on him before, and he sat at the kitchen table where everyone eventually sat. Clara had begun to think of it as the place where the county came to work things out, and told them that the restitution from the Holloway settlement had come through, and he'd used the first payment to buy back the water rights on his eastern 40. "Marion cried," he said. He seemed slightly awed by this. "I haven't seen Marion cry since our youngest was born," she said. He stopped, looked at Clara. "She said to tell you that she hopes you know what you did for us." "I know what you did for yourselves," Clara said. "You kept your records. Marion organized everything. All I did was look." "You looked when nobody else was going to," Jim said. "That's not a small thing." Clara thought about being 12 years old at a work table with her father's hand guiding hers. About the particular patience of a man who believed that what his daughter could see was worth teaching her to prove. "No," she said quietly. "It's not a small thing." After Jim left, Ethan found her on the porch in the April afternoon, and he stood beside her and said nothing for a while, which was how they did their best talking sometimes. "Frank stopped me in town yesterday," he said eventually. "How is he?" "Good. Better than I've seen him in years." Ethan leaned against the porch post. "He said something I've been thinking about." "Tell me." "He said the worst thing Margaret Holloway did wasn't the money. It wasn't even the land." He paused. "He said the worst thing was that she made him feel like he was stupid, like he'd failed at his own ranch through his own fault, like the numbers not working out was something wrong with him." He looked at Clara. "He said you gave that back to him, the understanding that he wasn't stupid, that he was just alone." Clara was quiet. "We're all alone until we aren't," she said. "Yes," Ethan said. He put his arm around her shoulders, the easy, settled way of a man who has stopped needing to make a decision about whether to do it, and she leaned into him, and the April sun was warm on the porch, and the ranch spread out before them, with its repaired barn, and its clean fence line, and its 12 new head of cattle, and all the visible evidence of a place that had been cared for and fought for and was going to keep being both. "I want to tell you something," Ethan said. "Tell me." "When you came through that gate," he said, "that first day, with your suitcase and your father's letter." He paused, and she felt him finding the words with the same care he brought to everything that mattered. "I thought you were a problem I hadn't budgeted for." "I know," she said. "By the third day," he said, "I thought you were the most capable person I had ever met." He paused again. "By the third week, I thought you were someone my life had needed for a very long time, and I hadn't known how to ask for." Clara did not trust her voice, so she waited. "I don't say things easily," he said. "You know that." "I know that. But I want to say this clearly so there's no arguing with it." He looked at her. "You are the best thing that has happened to me. Not the best thing since Eleanor. Not the best thing since the hard years. The best thing. Full stop. And I am aware every single day that your father gave me something I didn't deserve and couldn't have found on my own." Clara looked at the ranch, at the barn, at the land running east toward the boundary post, numbered 47 solid in the ground, where it had always been exactly where it was supposed to be. "You deserved it," she said. "You just needed someone to show up and see it." Same could be said for you, he said. She thought about that. Yes, she said. Same could be said for me. They went to see the Pacific Ocean that August. It took 3 days by rail, and the last leg of it was through country that got greener and stranger and more astonishing. The further west they went, and Ethan sat beside her on the train and watched it all with the particular alertness of a man seeing something he had wanted to see for a very long time and not being disappointed. When they finally stood on the beach, Clara had never seen the ocean either, a fact she'd kept to herself because it had seemed beside the point. The scale of it was something neither of them had words for immediately, which was fine because they had learned how to be in the silence together. The water was cold and loud and enormous and went on until it stopped making sense to look at it, and the wind off it tasted like something entirely different from anything in Montana. And Clara stood beside her husband at the edge of the continent and felt something let go in her that she hadn't entirely known she was holding. Her father had wanted her to have somewhere solid to stand. She was standing somewhere solid. She was standing beside someone who would not move. Ethan looked at the water for a long time. Then he looked at her. Worth it, he said. Yes, she said. Both things, he said. She understood what he meant. She took his hand. They stood there until the light changed and the wind got colder, and there was a practical matter of finding somewhere to eat supper and getting back to the hotel before dark, and then they turned away from the water together and walked back up the beach with the sound of it following them, enormous and indifferent and completely unconcerned with any of it. 2 years after Clara Whitmore arrived at the Caldwell gate with a suitcase and a dead man's letter, the ranch was running 60 degrees better than it had been. Not because the land had changed or the cattle market had changed, though that helped, but because two people who were each too much alone had found a way to be not alone that suited them both completely. Caleb had become indispensable and knew it and was paid accordingly, which Clara had insisted on, and Ethan had agreed to without argument after the third time Caleb stayed an extra 4 hours on a difficult day without being asked. Tom Briggs came to supper twice a month and argued about everything, and was right about half of it, which was a better average than most people Clara had known. Marion Caswell organized the Valley women into a rotating system for sharing harvest labor and somehow made it Clara's idea, which Clara had not minded, because the system worked, and that was what mattered. Frank Deller had his south pasture back and had stopped being bitter, which was Clara privately thought one of the greatest victories of the whole affair. And the Caldwell Ranch kitchen table, the table where all the serious things happened, where two people had sat across from each other, and then beside each other, and then close enough that the distance became not a gap, but a choice to close that table, was never quiet now, the way it had been quiet before. There was always coffee going. There was always work spread across part of it, and supper happening at another part. There was always at least one person from the valley sitting across from Clara, with something they needed help, understanding a record, a bill, a letter from someone official that didn't make sense until she explained it, and Ethan moving through the background of it with the easy, unhurried way of a man who had stopped needing to hold everything himself because he had someone to hold it with. On an evening in the second autumn, Clara was finishing a letter to Marshall Holt about a new case he'd sent her when Ethan came in from the barn and set a cup of coffee on the table beside her without saying anything and sat down across from her with his own cup. She kept writing. He read the book he'd borrowed from Tom Briggs. The fire spoke quietly to itself. Outside, the Montana dark came down fast and full over the mountains, the way it did, the way it always had, indifferent and enormous and entirely unconcerned with the small lit house at the edge of the valley. But the house held its warmth. It had learned how. Clara set down her pen. She looked at the man across from her, the closed, careful man who had learned to open the man who loved her in the quiet, persistent way of someone who had decided and did not need to keep deciding. And she thought about her father in the last days, reaching for the one solid thing he could give her. He had been right. He had been exactly right. Some promises are not burdens he had written in the letter. Sometimes a promise is the thing that gives a person a reason to live again. Thomas Whitmore had sent his daughter across 3 states with nothing but his faith in a man he'd pulled from the Montana wilderness 15 years before, and that faith had turned out to be the most accurate thing he ever knew. Clara picked up her pen. She finished the letter, and in the house that had once held only silence, the quiet between 2 people who had chosen each other every single day since a woman knocked on a gate with a suitcase and a dead man's promise was not silence at all. It was the sound of a life fully and finally and irrevocably home.